Something new popped up in Washington as well that President Bush could do without late in the campaign. The Iran-Contra special prosecutor in a new indictment has released notes of then Defense Secretary Casper Weinberger, indicating that at a January 1986 Oval Office meeting, President Reagan decided to offer 4,000 TOW missiles to Iran in exchange for 5 American hostages. Weinberger's note says Vice President Bush was in favor of the deal. Bush has long contended he was out of the loop on the arms for hostages decision. His spokesman, Marlon Fitzwater, says it's all been looked into before, and Bush has repeatedly said a $40 million investigation has proven no wrongdoing on his part.
Questions about an old scandal dog him. Information contained in a second indictment against former Defense Secretary Weinberg and released today seem to directly contradict Bush's claim he was out of the loop on Iran-Contra. The president's people brushed the issue off, saying it's nothing new.
While campaigning in Pittsburgh, Governor Clinton responded to the latest report on Bush's role in the Iran-Contra affair. The Democratic nominee used the report to turn the tables on Bush and the character issue.
Well, it raises the question, first, most importantly, about whether he's told the truth in this campaign and for the last 5 years. And secondly, it raises the whole question of his support for the policy. But the far more important thing is whether for 5 years he's been telling the American people something about his conduct of foreign policy as vice president, which was simply not true.
Clinton also said Weinberger's notes raise serious questions and diminish the credibility of the White House.
Good evening, Dan Rather reporting. There is new written evidence tonight concerning what President Bush knew and when he knew about the secret deal that sent some of America's best missiles to Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. The grand jury evidence raises new questions about whether Mr. Bush is telling the truth. CBS News law correspondent Rita Braver has details on this dramatic turn of events.
An embarrassing revelation for George Bush. Evidence released for the first time today contradicts his previous statements that he was out of the loop on the Reagan administration's deal to ship arms to Iran in exchange for American hostages. New charges returned in the ongoing case against former Defense Secretary Casper Weinberger detail Weinberger's handwritten notes of a meeting George Bush attended January 7, 1986. Weinberger writes that President Reagan decided to approve a scheme to release hostages in return for the sale of 4,000 TOW missiles to Iran by Israel. Weinberger opposed. Others, including Vice President Bush, favored the deal.
This is further very strong evidence that George Bush knew all about the trading of arms for hostages, which he has consistently denied.
For years, over and over again, Mr. Bush claimed neither he nor President Reagan knew the details.
The president is absolutely convinced that he did not swap arms for hostages.
President Bush has changed his story several times, and in fact, earlier this month, appeared to admit he knew something about the deal.
But you knew about the arms for hostages?
Yes, and I've said so all along.
But in that same interview, the president also denied being at key meetings, including the one in the note released today, where Weinberger opposed the trade. New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis, who's been tracking the president's Iran-Contra connection, says it's ironic George Bush is trying to make Bill Clinton's truthfulness an issue.
It's the President of the United States deliberately, knowingly, forcefully telling you an untruth year after year, month after month. That's going to destroy our faith in our political system.
The independent counsel insists the release of the note was timed to meet the schedule for Casper Weinberger's trial, not to embarrass the president in the final days of the campaign. Rita Braver, CBS News, Washington.
The grand jury evidence appears to be at variance with what then Vice President Bush said in an interview on this broadcast in 1988. The president sent one of his spokesmen out today to say there is nothing new in the Weinberger note. White House correspondent Susan Spencer is with the president on the campaign trail in St. Louis. Susan?
Dan, the Bush campaign was both very angry and very defensive about this story, saying that any claim that this somehow contradicts Mr. Bush's assertion that he was not in the loop on the arms sale is, quote, pure political hogwash. Aides insisted that the president has answered every question on this, that nothing has changed, and that everything in this memo was already known. So when asked about the new memo, spokesman Marlon Fitzwater had this somewhat odd reaction.
There isn't one!
The campaign may try to laugh it off, but Mr. Bush does not need questions about his truthfulness while he's trying to convince voters that he, unlike Governor Clinton, is the man of honor and trust, a point he made today at a surprisingly small afternoon rally in Missouri.
What the president does reflects all around the world. People judge our country to a large degree by that. They are interlocked, and I don't believe you can have a person in the White House who's going to try to be on all sides of every issue, flip-flopping. The pattern of deceit is wrong for America.
Aides said none of this would lessen Mr. Bush's enthusiasm for the character issue. Added spokesman Fitzwater, I hate to accuse anyone of politics, but it does seem mighty suspicious that the Clinton people would try to stir this thing up. Dan?
Susan Spencer, thanks. Governor Clinton was quick today to once again question the president's truthfulness. Richard Threlkeld is with the Clinton campaign in Pittsburgh. Dick?
Dan, all along, the Clinton campaign has been trying to make an issue of George Bush's credibility. The revelations today about Iran-Contra played right into that theme.
Today's disclosure that President Bush knew and approved of the arms for hostages deal with Iran not only directly contradicts the president's claims, it diminishes the credibility of the presidency. It raises the question, first and most importantly, about whether he's told the truth in this campaign and for the last 5 years. And secondly, it raises the whole question of his support for the policy. But the far more important thing is whether for 5 years he's been telling the American people something about his conduct of foreign policy as vice president, which was simply not true.
We now have the evidence, the smoking gun memorandum, the clear proof that what George Bush has said about his role in creating one of the worst, most embarrassing catastrophes in American foreign policy is simply untrue. How can he now ask the American people to trust him?
Despite this bombshell, the Clinton campaign still thinks that this election will turn on the issue of the economy. And Dan, that's the issue that Bill Clinton will be stressing in a campaign marathon the next 3 days that will take him to more than a dozen states, winding up at dawn on Election Day in Denver, Colorado. Dan.
Richard Threlkeld with the Clinton-Gore campaign in Pittsburgh. Thanks. As for how the Ross Perot campaign is reacting to today's developments, let's go to correspondent Bill Lagatuda at Perot headquarters in Dallas. Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, Dan. Here at the Perot campaign, they're privately delighted at the timing of this Iran-gate development. They say it makes their candidate look more credible when he attacks the party of George Bush.
This is the same party that gave us Watergate. This is the same party that gave us Iran-Contra. This is the same party that's up to its ears in Iraq-gate now.
Revisiting this development today on the Iran-Contra thing and Casper Weinberger's notes, is that just another blip, or does that have the potential for causing some problems for the president?
I think a great deal is going to depend upon the way the press plays the story in the next 2 or 3 days, Jim. It has
I must say, just internally, it was a hard decision we had to make as to how to play that story tonight. It's very difficult.
I think everybody is having a hard time. I've heard various other news organizations are going through the same internal agony. Is it a big, important story, or is it so political, or is it so close to the election?
Is everything political now?
Is everything political now? Yeah. On its face, coming today, and to remind people, it's the indictment of Casper Weinberger, citing notes from Casper Weinberger in a meeting in early 1986. The notes on their face contradict what George Bush has always said about his account of the Iran-Contra affair.
Just about when he knew about it.
When he knew about it. It places him in the loop, quote, a year earlier than he says, in effect, that he knew. I think the timing of the indictment will strike many Republicans as suspicious, coming 4 days ahead of time. On the other hand, the content of the indictment is going to give ammunition to the Democrats to say, this issue is about trust. There's one man in this race who has not been telling us the truth about something very fundamental, and there's no question I think the Democrats are going to try to exploit this.
Mark?
Jim, the Clinton people, if you had AT&T stock this afternoon, you're in good shape, because they were burning up the lines pushing this story. Doesn't this prove the trust thing? Doesn't it prove it? I frankly think it's tough to make the argument that foreign policy is not an issue in the campaign, then to come back and say, well, but foreign policy is an issue because it's a trust issue as a foreign policy issue.
Political scandal. President Bush sought to clear the air about evidence that appears to contradict his position that he was out of the loop on the arms for hostages scandal. More now from CNN's Anthony Collins.
Did then Vice President Bush favor a specific arms for hostages deal with Iran in January 1986? Mr. Bush has said it wasn't clear to him until 11 months later that arms were being traded for hostages. But pretrial court papers in the indictment of former Defense Secretary Casper Weinberger quote from Weinberger's notes seeming to contradict Mr. Bush on when he knew. According to a new count in the indictment by the Iran-Contra Independent Counsel, Vice President Bush attended a January 1986 White House meeting. At that meeting, President Reagan approved an Israeli sale of 4,000 U.S. TOW anti-tank missiles in exchange for the release of 5 American hostages held in Lebanon. Weinberger's note said, VP favored. The new evidence quickly became a campaign issue.
Today's disclosure that President Bush knew and approved of the arms for hostages deal with Iran not only directly contradicts the president's claims, it diminishes the credibility of the presidency.
A Clinton-Gore campaign said the revelation was a smoking gun, but President Bush denied it contained anything new. Questioned by Larry King about the specific numbers in the Weinberger notes, Mr. Bush reiterated his earlier position, implying the arms for hostages link was not clear to him at the time.
And for a frantic governor of Arkansas, at the last minute, when he feels something slipping away from him, to say this is a smoking gun, it is absolutely absurd.
Mr. Bush said the timing of the prosecutor's revelation was strange. Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh also was attacked by Weinberger's lawyer. He accused Walsh of playing politics.
They've had this information for years. There can be no doubt anymore that this is not about justice. This is an outrageous political prosecution.
Analysts said that Weinberger's notes, revealed in the new count of his indictment, were significant.
But the new information is, I think, the final nail in the coffin of George Bush's story about being out of the loop on Iran-Contra.
In the past, Mr. Bush has said he knew the Reagan administration was sending arms to Iran and that some hostages were being released, but that he did not realize at the time that this was arms for hostages. A spokeswoman for the Iran-Contra prosecutor denied that politics played a role in releasing the evidence involving Mr. Bush 4 days before the election. Anthony Collins, CNN.
As far as the Republicans are concerned, the issue they're trying to make hay with is the truth and trust issue, Steve. But now the Democrats hope to turn that against George Bush.
Well, that's right, Paul. As we've said around this table a number of times, this election was going to come down to 2 5-letter words beginning with T. One was taxes, that Howard's talking about, and the other is trust. And this week, in many ways, trust did come to the forefront. And as Howard mentioned, you had both of the candidates, major candidates, trying to raise the anxiety level, trying to raise the questions about the other's character and judgment. The core of the Bush campaign has been to try to convince people that Bill Clinton a little too slippery, a little too immature, to be the symbol of the nation, to sit in the Oval Office, to be the person picking up the phone when the crisis happens. And the polls show that this has been working. We did a poll at U.S. News showing that Clinton's negatives were up this week. When we asked who was most steady and trustworthy, Bush came out ahead, even though he was far behind in the popular vote. He came out ahead on that issue. But the Clinton people, having seen these numbers, have been very alarmed, and they're trying to diffuse this issue by counterattacking, as you say. We've heard a lot about George Bush. How can you trust George Bush if he broke his pledge on taxes, coddled Saddam Hussein? And then this today, we had a real interesting break for the Clinton folks, because it was published that notes were published in an indictment proceeding taken by Casper Weinberger, Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, who took notes at a White House meeting in January of 1968. And these notes prove quite conclusively that George Bush not only knew about the Iran-Contra trade of arms for hostages, but also approved of it. George Bush has said repeatedly that he was out of the loop, that he didn't know, and we're going to hear a lot more about that in the final couple of days.
I bet we do, and a whole lot of people want to know.